Cities and towns are urging the Scott administration to provide options for unhoused residents as roughly 230 households enrolled in the state's emergency housing program reach a new 80-day limit on voucher stays.
In Shelburne, 23 adults and 8 children lose their homes.
It's a difficult situation. Understand the point of view of the municipalities as well, but we don't have the resources either, and so we're in the position we're at.
Plus, how cyber scams are defrauding Vermonters, and a new report advocates for dramatic changes to Vermont's healthcare system. That and more ahead on Vermont This Week.
From the Vermont Public Studio in Winooski, this is Vermont This Week. Made possible in part by the Lintelak Foundation and Milne Travel. Here's moderator Mitch Wertlieb.
Thanks so much for being with us. I'm Mitch Wertlieb. It's Friday, September 20th. And joining us on the panel today, we have Calvin Cutler from WCAX, Derek Brouwer from 7 Days, and Carly Berlin from VTDigger and Vermont Public. Thank you all so much for being here. Carly, we're going to start with some of your reporting on a really difficult issue, and this deals with folks who are now being told they must leave Vermont's Motel voucher program. Some context here first. When did the folks using the Motel housing program first sort of enter into it in this iteration we know of now, and why are they being told to leave now?
Yes, people have entered in at different times, right? But this program expanded greatly during the pandemic. We had an influx of federal money to, put people up in hotel and motel rooms to allow them to social distance from COVID. Yeah. The reason that they're leaving now is, for years, state leaders have been, fighting, grappling with how to scale this program back. We got to see during COVID our, numbers of people experiencing homelessness in Vermont skyrocket. There are a lot more people in this program now than ever utilized a prior version of it that existed before the pandemic. And right now, there are new limits kicking in that lawmakers passed this past spring. So there are two different ones. There's a new limit on the number of rooms available in the program that kicked in this past Sunday. And then there's a new limit on the number of nights people can have a voucher for. So those vouchers will last for 80 days. Those limits are kicking in this week. Okay.
What's different about some of the population of people who are leaving now?
Right. So, over the last few years, we've seen these mass exits from the program before. What's different right now is that lawmakers have extended motel stays for people who meet certain vulnerability criteria, families with kids, people with extreme disabilities, people who are elderly. That's done now. No one is protected from this new 80-day limit. And so as people reach those, starting yesterday, we're seeing families with kids leave motels with nowhere else to go.
Nowhere else to go. You've met some of these families. What are some stories you've heard?
Yeah, I spent yesterday with a family of 4 in Shelburne who has 2 kids with autism. They have been in the program since late last year when they had a no-cause eviction from their apartment in Burlington. And, they have tried to get into a shelter. They called the family shelter in Burlington, which is full and has a long wait list. They actually have a housing voucher to help them pay rent, but they can't find anywhere to use it that will, meet the the rent threshold that you need when you use one of those. And so they have few options. They don't have family that they can stay with. Parents have passed away. And so, people are leaving these hotels and motels with, really no other option in front of them.
And nowhere to go. Here's what a Good Samaritan Haven outreach worker had to say about all this.
The priorities right now are going to be families with children, and then we're going to be going from there with the most vulnerable and just doing our best to help, because really the congregate shelters are not the answer for most of the people that are in the motels.
The congregate shelters she was talking about, what are those like? What is she describing there?
Yeah, I think what she's describing is, shelter spaces where you have, one big room with cots with, a bunch of beds together where people don't have a lot of privacy. Yeah. The hotel program is the opposite of that. People have their own room and a little bit of space to themselves.
A place to sleep safely and feel okay. So, all of this is happening now, and it's it's really scary for a lot of people. The idea is that they can last till December when they have the option to come back to these motels?
Yeah, it's a little confusing. So these two different caps I talked about, the cap on the number of rooms the state's going to pay for this year and the number of nights people can have, both of those limits are going to lift during the winter months. Okay. So the program is going to expand again. You know, people who ran out their 80-day clock are going to be able to come back in. There's not going to be this 1,100 room threshold that the state needs to stay under. So people need to figure out what, you know, if they intend to come back in December, something to do in between. You know, I've spoken to a lot of people who are finding tents and finding places to put them.
If they can. So this has led now to town officials urging state officials to say, look, this is a serious deal here. We have a real big homelessness problem. They're saying something's got to be done. So what was the fallout from all that? Governor Scott was responding to some of this, right? Yeah,
so the most immediate thing that the municipal leaders were calling for at this press conference they held this week was for the state to open up state buildings for shelters and state land for sanctioned encampments that the state would then oversee. You know, there was a version of this that happened this past March, people might remember, where the state opened up a couple of, you know, very bare bones shelters across the state for people to go to when we had another round of exits from the program. Very few people made their way to those. And members of the Scott administration have said, you know, pointed to that, how few people came and said, you know, okay, perhaps people actually have somewhere else to go and use that as a rationale to, you know, not mount a similar response this time. At the time, service providers were saying, no one's been notified that these shelters are here. They don't have a way to get to them, you know, all of those things. And so, you know, right now there is no option to direct people toward when they're leaving.
Calvin, you've been reporting on this too.
Right. It's been really fascinating to see this program grow during the pandemic, and here it is. It's really painful for everybody involved to try to unwind this. I remember when during COVID, in the legislature, as they were extending it over and over and keeping, you know, a roof over people's heads, I remember asking, you know, what's the plan? What's the strategy? What is our end goal here? And as you know, during the pandemic, the state put in over $500 million. It was about $500, maybe $600 million into affordable housing for developers, for Champlain Housing Trust and for Evernorth and others. And I remember lawmakers telling me at the time, the goal is to use some of that money to build more affordable housing, more permanent housing, you know, shelters, X, Y, and Z, right? And so the idea was to build that housing, have that all come online so people could then get into that housing. But the problem is, as well as we've seen over the past few years with labor shortages, inflation, you know, lending and
price of materials too to build these
price
things.
of materials, yeah. Exactly, and that has not materialized. And so the hotel program being a bridge to more permanent housing, it's a plan that has really been challenged. And so now, you know, state leaders and the people who are leaving these programs have to make these really, really difficult choices.
I want to mention one other thing too, Carly, that you've been reporting on. It's not a side issue, it's all connected, but there has been this perception, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, that a lot of people feel like, well, you know, the Motel voucher program and things like that in Vermont, it's been kind of a draw for people who are unhoused, who are homeless from out of state to come to Vermont, take advantage of that. You did some reporting on this for Brave Little State, a special episode on that, and we're going to direct folks to that, but you know, you really dug into that issue to find out whether this is a myth or not, right?
I did, yeah. You know, writing about homelessness, this was the number one question that prompted people to reach out to me, you know, over the course of the last year.
They were asking you that specifically?
Specifically, my inbox was full of these questions. I decided to start calling people who had reached out with it to kind of probe, you know, what is leading you to think this and ask me about it. So that was the, you know, the catalyst for spending, you know, 40 minutes digging into to this question for Brave Little State. So,
but it is worth a listen. I really want to direct people to that episode of Brave Little State to find out the real information about what's going on with all these things. I want to turn now to a story that is not any more positive, I'm afraid. Derek Brouwer, you wrote about this in 7 days. It is I don't know what to call it, really. It makes you sad when you read it. It makes you angry. We're talking about cyber scams that have really hit people in Vermont. One woman in particular told her your story. What is going on here? Who's being affected?
Yeah, when I started reporting on this story, I thought I understood everything about scams. You get these alerts occasionally. There's a news story every year or so. And as I got into it and started talking to these women for the story, I realized I knew so little about how these scams actually work and the impact that they have. So what I focused in on was a couple of women who were victims of what's called a tech support scam. So this is basically a pop-up that comes on your computer. In some cases, there's a loud screaming sound that tells you you've been hacked, you need to call this number for support. You call the number, and it's often an illicit call center in another country. And those the people who answer the phone are posing as tech support workers. In some cases, Apple, Microsoft, it can be anybody. And from there, they've got your attention, they have you scared, and they convince you that to protect your finances from these hackers, they will coach you on how to move money into other accounts. And the really astounding thing was that this scam can then play out over a period of weeks and months. So the women I spoke with, they told me they were on the phone with these scammers every day for a period of 2 months. Up to one woman was in Bennington. It took her 6 months to move her entire life savings into these cryptocurrency accounts. She ended up losing $950,000.
And that was her entire nest egg, her savings, everything, right? That she'd built up over many years.
Yeah, she had worked in human resources and marketing for a tech company. She was able to retire at age 59, and she moved back to Bennington, where she remembered being the happiest in her life. And so she was really well set, but she was also alone and isolated in this town where she didn't really know anybody. So she didn't have somebody to bounce this off of. And very quickly, once she was on the phone with these scammers, they coached her. They said, you don't know who has hacked you. You can't tell anybody about this. Don't trust anyone. You don't know who's behind it. And so they became, for this period of 6 months, really the only people this woman was talking to. She was even confiding with them. They became the only people she could trust during this period of time.
That's another amazing thing about your story, because we often think about elderly people being vulnerable here, and they are. I mean, a lot of elderly people are targeted for these scams, but there was a quote in your article that said, sometimes it's not about who you are, but how you are. And describing this woman, it's where you are in your life, and if you're vulnerable, isolated, often that can be a target for these scammers, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was from a fraud expert who worked with AARP, and they did some surveys that found that people who had experienced really stressful life events in the months before the scammer targeted them were more likely to fall for the scam. And in the case of both of the women I spoke with, they met that criteria. They had gone through some difficult things, and they were alone, like so many older Vermonters are. So I think this is a really important point, Mitch. I think that there's this widespread misconception that you have to be gullible or stupid to fall for these, and it's not true. These scams are both really sophisticated, and they call thousands and thousands of people. They plant this malware, these pop-ups on almost everybody's computer, and so they're gonna catch people. And the thing is, once they do have their hook in, it's not just the money that victims lose. There's so much shame associated with this, and there is a sense of helplessness.
And I would think too that maybe we don't even know how many people are affected because of that shame that you're talking about. Doesn't a lot of this go unreported because people just don't want to admit this happened to them? Yeah,
that's right. I mean, the FBI has. I mean, there are about 150 Vermonters a year, give or take, who report that kind of theft to the FBI. Last year, elders in particular reported losing almost $5 million in Vermont, but that's really, all indications are that's a low ball. That many people suffer silently with this. They don't even tell their friends or family. In fact, the woman who I profile in the story, the scam happened 3 years ago, and she still hasn't told her son or her brother. And she planned to actually give them the story once it published as a way to finally tell them what she'd been going through.
And briefly, there's a double whammy here too, because there are tax implications that from the federal government, as I understand it.
Yeah, I was saying I thought I knew everything about scams, and I didn't. This was the biggest shock to me, is that because victims are so often coerced into or induced into withdrawing money from investment accounts like 401ks, according to the IRS, you still have tax money on that. So this woman in Bennington who I profile, she was hit with over $160,000 in owed taxes afterward. Now, interestingly, there used to be a straightforward deduction on your tax return that you could take to account for this kind of theft loss. But in 2017, when Republicans in Congress passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, they were looking for ways to pay for their other tax cuts, and so they pared down this deduction. And now that is, in the year since, that has left victims with little recourse to deal with this massive tax bill. And there is still a way you can get it reduced, but it involves a ton of work that is beyond the capability of some people, especially when they're so distraught. And also there's no guarantees. So this woman who I'm talking about in Bennington, she ended up paying just over, about $6,000 in taxes after the fact, which she had been left with $10,000 in her accounts, and then more than half of that went towards settling her income and property taxes.
The last thing I'll say about this is people should read this story, and also one thing I appreciated is that at the bottom there at the end, you have tips on how to try to avoid some of these things. They're listed there, and again, this is the kind of thing that a lot of people could fall for. It's not just elderly people, so I appreciate you putting in those tips to try and avoid these things and what to do if you think this is happening to you. So thank you for that reporting. Calvin, I want to turn now to a healthcare story that also has a lot of us concerned here in the state of Vermont. The Green Mountain Care Board has approved hospital budgets, but what we're hearing is from an outside report that Vermont's hospitals are kind of going bankrupt.
Yeah.
Is that the truth?
This conversation has been years in the making, and it's a challenge faced by Vermont, but also rural healthcare nationally, right? And it's kind of gets back to this: how do you deliver service in a rural state with a declining demographic and a declining working age population? So the Green Mountain Care Board this week approved about $150-ish million in new hospital spending across Vermont's 14 hospitals. And that new spending is driven by staff wages, infrastructure costs, administrative costs across all of our hospitals. In recent years, especially since the pandemic, healthcare costs have really been going through the roof. And so when you have hospital budgets that go up, commercial insurance premiums also increase. In the past few years, those have increased by double digits for private insurance, Blue Cross Blue Shield, MVP. And when your health insurance rates go up, that's your deductible, right? That's you're paying more, and it falls on small businesses, and it falls on Vermonters. So that's why people are potentially getting priced out here. I mean, that's the real concern, is that people can't afford to pay their insurance company, so they forego care. Their conditions get worse, and it gets more expensive to treat it later on. Maybe you have to take an ambulance or X, Y, and Z. So that's the risk. You mentioned our hospitals, especially rural ones, are bleeding cash. It was really 5 years ago when Springfield Hospital declared bankruptcy that this set off all kinds of alarm bells within the Green Mountain Care Board, within the legislature, the Agency of Human Services, and they said, we need to do something. So there's been hospital sustainability work that they've been hosting all kinds of community forums and panels with hospitals and communities to try to get a sense of where should our resources be, what services should each hospital provide, and what should just the physical footprint of our hospitals look like. Do we need 14 full-service hospitals? And there was a mammoth 144-page report that was issued this week from a consultant, Oliver Wyman, which brought forward some pretty, really challenging, I think I'll say, recommendations that are going to be ahead.
I want to get to some of those recommendations in a moment. Here's what the consultant had to say about the state of the hospitals.
Most hospitals are currently financially unsustainable, and we project by 2028, 13 of the 14 will report even more significant financial losses. Hospitals will need to reconfigure their services and the sites where they deliver them so that more is done away from the inpatient units of the hospital.
Okay, reconfigure their services. I've tried to imagine what that means. Can you sort of bullet point or highlight some of the points in this consultant's report that makes recommendations for how Vermont must change?
Yeah, there's 4 hospitals that really are in the crosshairs of it. Essentially cutting back services or closing hospital beds, closing overnight stays, and shifting resources to more long-term care and mental health, and senior care, using some of those inpatient facilities for that, and taking more intense medical care and putting that to primary care or to service providers elsewhere in the community, more clinic-based care, as opposed to people getting their primary care at hospitals, because hospital care is very expensive. So that's what he kind of means. But the big elephant in the room is closing beds. These hospitals, and this was why Springfield was such a wake-up call. These hospitals are huge employers. I mean, Gifford employs 500 people alone. And it's not just, the jobs, but it's the peace of mind as well. Having a hospital, having an emergency room in your community. And it's not just for Randolph. If you're in Braintree, per se, or all these smaller, Roxbury, smaller towns that, really feed into these hospitals. So if you, don't have a hospital, if you don't have an emergency room, or you can't, visit your OBGYN doctor in Randolph, you might have to go and commute all the way to Dartmouth, Hitchcock, or to UVM. And we talk about seniors, vulnerable Vermonters, in a rural state where transportation is really challenged. These are going to be really tough conversations.
Very tough. And you're talking about, we talk about this almost every week, the aging demographic of Vermont. And when people are older, they need more medical care. This is cost-saving stuff, but it doesn't seem to me like taking away beds for a population that seems to need more of them is going to work.
Exactly, and that's the thing, is it's this chicken and the egg sort of cycle we get. We need to grow our demographics, we need to get out of this, but but at the same time, if you can't grow your way out, the problem compounds and gets worse and worse. It's this merry-go-round of spiraling healthcare costs that we as a state just can't get off of. I talked with economic development folks in Randolph to see what would this closure mean for you in the community, and they say that this hospital is too important for them to lose. They say that they have employers with about 200 open jobs, and they also have lots that are ready to be built, hooked up to water and sewer. They say they need the legislature and the state to take housing and allow for more housing to be built and to continue that work, because they say we need to grow our way out of this. And they say that these hospitals are worth fighting for. So it's there, as I said, a lot of really difficult decisions ahead, and these are going to be very passionate. Just like the school funding, what should the future of our education system look like? How do you deliver education in a rural state? The stakes are going to be really high here, and the timeline is very compressed, anywhere from 3 to 4 years potentially before some of these hospitals really get into a challenging place.
I'm seeing connections here between the hospital problem and the housing problem. Carly, are you seeing that too?
Yeah, I absolutely am. And one of the things you hear a lot about older Vermonters in particular is they're in these large homes that are aging too and need a lot of maintenance that they can't keep up with. And as our population shifts older too, when older people have kids, those kids don't have places to move. And then older people who want to, perhaps downsize into a smaller unit, would be looking at really high mortgage rates and incredibly high prices if they wanted to move somewhere smaller to unlock that larger house for a growing family. And so we have this gridlock in our housing market too that makes it hard for people already here to move around and really challenging for growth.
It's in housing, it's in healthcare. You've got patients that need long-term care or need mental health placements, but they can't because beds are full and there's just no flow through the system. Whether we're talking about, a new family trying to get the missing middle starter home, or if it's a senior or somebody, looking to get into a detox bed or a sober living facility. It's a big challenge.
And what are Vermont's political leaders saying about solutions?
Well, the governor has talked about, number one, continuing to grow our economy, recruit more workers. I think his line is, we need more taxpayers, not more taxes, is what he said. But he also acknowledged that, we probably do need to be more strategic in where we put our resources and spending, and, rethinking whether some of these hospitals are the best use of our money, and if we can actually afford 14 full-service hospitals. So that's sort of what the governor said. I haven't actually checked in with any state lawmakers on this as of yet. Most of the work here will be done by the Agency of Human Services, the Green Mountain Care Board. There were a number of policy prescriptions, including moving forward with payment reform, with the all-payer model, for the legislature, investing in housing and continuing to move forward with that. So, yeah, there's a lot here.
there is a lot here. And,
Yeah.
My guess, and I'm just going to make a prediction, at some point, someone is going to talk about an idea that then Governor Peter Shumlin had about a universal health care system. Whether or not that is sustainable to happen, but you remember that, I'm sure.
You bet. Oh, yeah, and on Monday, actually, there's advocates. I think it's the Medicaid Army is advocates of single payer are already voicing their concern about this plan, and I think we might start to see next session the Universal Healthcare Caucus maybe getting out more in front of this. So it's going to be interesting.
We'll follow that for sure. I'm determined to go out on somewhat of a high note. Fans of pro basketball, it is coming back to Central Vermont. The VT Coyotes will be playing their games at Barry Auditorium. This is the first team to be here since the Vermont Frost Heaves played at the Aud, and they won 2 national championships, by the way. So good luck to the VT Coyotes as well when they start playing basketball. They'll start recruiting. Next month there'll be a press conference about this, and we'll have basketball back in Central Vermont. I want to thank our panel so much for being here today. Calvin Cutler, Derek Brouwer, and Carly Berlin. It's been wonderful having you and sharing your insights with us, and thank you all so much for your reporting. I'm Mitch Wertlieb. I really appreciate you watching and listening, and we will see you next week here on Vermont This Week. I hope you have a great week in the meantime.